Hello. Can I make a tiny little modular synth inspired by the way James Holden makes modular synths, where computer-like things do all of the voice generation and control, and we run that through analog filters, letting analog filters do what they do best. This is Suggested Systems 9, using a Disting NT to create a little performance system in 62 HP. So let me just play this for you for a minute, and then I'm going to explain how this works. Everything you're hearing is coming out of the Disting NT. The Disting is generating the oscillators and the control voltages, which are going into the filters. I'm using offsets here, the 3 modules on the left. And these are controlling things inside the Disting. And the Disting is doing the mixing, applying effects, and it's also creating the drums. But this Tubbutec Drummertime is there to create the triggers, the patterns for the drums. Here I've just set up a little 2-pattern chain, and I'm opening up the filter that is filtering the drums. So what just happened? What did I just load up? Well, so as I said in the intro, this is a kind of complete performance system. And by that I mean that there's a few different voices and there's some drums as well. There's much more I could have done with this, and I'll talk about that later, but I kept it kind of deliberately simple to make this manageable for me to do with limited experience with the Disting NT. We have a Plaits running inside the Disting. And I'm running the Plaits through a Jove. It's coming out and through the Jove. So this digital voice is getting an analog filter. And then I'm sending control into the Jove. 2 different types of it. I've got an envelope, which I control with this. I've got 1 knob to control it. And it's being blended with a Turing machine, which is inside the Disting NT and comes out. So the Disting is sending a mix of Turing and my envelope. And I've got effects here on this knob, a bit of reverb that I can send it through. And then I can play drums. And the drums are being triggered by the Drummertime by Tubbutec. And the MIDI is coming out and going into the Disting NT. And I've got patterns on here that I have saved and I can recall, which is very nice. And then I've got a second voice, which is the Braids, and that's going through the Centaur's gate. And I can change the mode on the Braids. And I can also change the envelope. And so I have 2 voices working together, in tune with one another because they're being quantized by the same things inside the Disting. And then I'm running the drums through a filter as well, so I can mute them down. And then I thought it would be nice to have some kind of control for the drums, so I've created an envelope follower in the Disting as well. Woo. And I can go Apply effects. And then you're off to the races. Now on the Disting NT there is a thing called Performance Page. A Performance Page is a page where you can have a bunch of controls kind of brought out to the front panel for you. So I've assigned a couple of things. I could do much more and have more controls in my patch. But what this is letting me do here is control the braids because I've run out of kind of input knobs. Ooh. That's an interesting sound we just picked. Yeah. One thing I might like to do here is switch this into Highpass mode. Because of course then you can do your kind of drummy high-pass drops. Yeah. And then what I've got is I've got two cheering machines, and this is the sort of lock control for either of them. So that's what's making the pattern. And if I turn this one to unlock, it's quite a lot of fun, actually. And so what is the Disting doing? And what is everything else doing? Well, the point here is like what James Holden did, who uses like a little mini computer, maybe even a Mac Mini. And then James does a lot of the modulation creation with his amazing environment that he creates called Benny. I will link Benny below. Benny does not get talked about nearly enough. And what he's doing is he's using the computer for what computers are good at. Computers are good at creating voices and digital voices, and they're also really good at creating control. You know, there's no reason why a computer can't make a really good LFO, envelope, step sequencer, and all of these types of things. And so if you let a computer do that, then you leave yourself free to give yourself some limited interactive controls and then analog filters to run it through. Because I've got my drums, and then I've created an envelope following here that's actually listening to the raw drums themselves. And so where are the drums coming from? Well, the drums are obviously coming off the Disting. And so in here, there is a sample player. This sample player module I've got set up with a bunch of drum sounds that I curated from its like built-in library. And then I'm using this Tubbutec module as the trigger, and it's important to say that it's using MIDI. And actually the Disting is clocking it as well. So the Disting clocks this module, the Disting receives the MIDI from the module just via 3.5mm cables. And then what I'm doing here with the drums is that I am just playing back patterns that I have written. I'm very inspired by an artist called Mike Inc. And something that Mike Inc. did in this set that's amazing, and I'll link below, is that Mike has a bunch of patterns, including a blank one and a fill one. I mean, this is a bit of a busy fill. And you build up from sort of less busy to more busy. And even on this, I can actually have it so it bops between things, which is nice. But to be clear, all the drums themselves are coming in real time off the disting. Very cool. And then I'm running it through this filter. Amazing. From the disting into it. And I'm also creating the envelope follower in the disting. And then that's going into this filter to control it. And then we've got the braids, as mentioned, and I've got the tuning machine that controls it. I can choose the mode, and then I've got an envelope. I've created a VCA inside the disting, which controls the voice, and then that envelope also gets fed out to here, so that the envelope controls this real analog filter too that the disting sends the braids through. And that's super limited. I don't have more control, except, do you remember that on the performance page? I've got performance controls for it. Now, what is it that I'm controlling this with? Well, these are DC offsets. And a DC offset is just the name of a module that when you turn the knob, it just creates a fixed amount of voltage that doesn't change. It's like the worst LFO ever. It just stays in the same position and never moves. And so as I turn this down, there is a voltage that is going down. And as I turn it up, there's a voltage that's going up. In fact, if I take you into here and I'll show you the tuning for bass that I've named, because you can name the modules and change the name, which, believe me, is helpful, you may be able to see that it's actually listening to this. And this is because you can map controls coming into the disting to a multitude of things. And so what I chose to do was create kind of control knobs that weren't on the interface themselves. That I've now got these extra control knobs and I've maxed out the Disting NT's inputs and outputs. And so I use these offset knobs to do different things. I've just chosen some things. And the knobs could be doing more than one thing. They could be doing loads of things at the same time. And another thing to say very quickly is that if you wanted more knobs than is possible via CV, then you can also map this via MIDI. So you could have like a 16N or one of those other types of controllers, or like the Novation launch control. And you could be sending that into the MIDI input of the disting because it's got a MIDI input on this expander. And then you'd actually have like 16 knobs to control these things with as well. And at lower cost than buying the 3 offset modules. And then, yeah, my final voice is this thing with Plaits, my ever faithful Plaits. And I mapped the mode, and I think harmonic is the thing that is on this knob, depends on the mode. This is the DX7 mode, isn't it? And then I have to turn up this. And this is where we hear that I've got 2 things going in, my envelope and my tuning machine that's in there. And the tuning machine, luxuriously, is simply there to help modulate the filter. Because that's the other thing that you can do with the disting is, you know, you can have many modules and you can share outputs so that 5 or 6 modules could be shoving data out of one output and mixing it together for you. So you get a much more complex signal out to your modules. It can do that quite easily. You just set the mode to add in the little stack. And then I've got reverb. This is the reverb from Clouds as a send on the virtual mixer that's inside this that I've created. To use the Disting NT, of course, is to use these kind of controls on the front panel. And you may note, if you have sight, that I have labeled the panel to help me, because the panel itself does not have labeling. There is actually a pop-up menu that you can have appear so here, where if you turn the controls, it will give you a kind of preview. But I personally found this of limited use because I struggled to make the connection between the position on the page at the bottom and the location of both the buttons and the knobs. And so what I did is I labeled the thing. That helped a lot with the learning process for me. And as I'm sure you would use a Disting NT for a lot longer than I've had with it, then you just learn what everything is and you don't need to look at labels anymore. But early on, that could help you. And so also, as we looked at, there is this kind of stack this sort of column that is all of your various modules in a row. Now, of course, we can do multi-voice things as I have in this patch, but of course we also have just this one column to represent it. And the way that we create change is that we go in here and we use these little aux buses, where CV here comes out of aux 3. And if I go into the quantizer and then the quantizer's channel input, we can see that CV in comes from aux 3. And so this is how we connect wires of a kind. But it is possible for aux 3 to kind of end for this chain and for aux 3 to be used for different things later in the chain. And in general, I did find managing a chain of signal processing for both clocks and audio in and out of the module across all of these various blocks in multi-channel voicing, but all in this one column. I found it, after a while, quite a head scratcher. And so what I did was I created an actual I/O list, actually wrote down what I have all of these things connected to. And you could even go so far as to actually sketch out so that you know what auxes you're using in various places. Because while we have these little dots which help indicate what the auxes are, and you can kind of line them up, there's a lot going on in this patch. It's a thing to manage. And so there's something else, which is there's an app called NT Helper. And NT Helper is designed to work via the USB cable and talk to the live Disting NT. What it lets me do here is I can actually see my patch all laid out. And then I can also come to parameters and I can move through the various blocks in the patch and I can actually see and adjust all their settings on here. So you can kind of design a whole patch just in this nice interface. But there is a very big caveat to say here, something you've got to be aware of, which is that this representation where we see a kind of what looks like a traditional sort of modular patch is an analogy. And it's actually an analogy that doesn't really carry into the way that the Disting NT actually works, because you must remember that the order of blocks that are in the column of the Disting NT changes whether it can be mapped from one aux to the next. And so here I could create wirings with auxes that wouldn't really work properly because a certain module is after another one in the patch. And we can actually see these numbers 10, 12, 9, 11, 3. And this is telling you that's actually where it is in the patch. But you do need to know that this kind of free modular patching where anything could root back into itself as we get in other types of modular environments is not actually how the Disting NT works. Now there's one more thing. There's actually a third way of editing the Disting NT, which I should show you. And it's a little web-based application made by expert sleepers. And the key thing to say about it up front is that it does better show how the true Disting NT patch is routed internally. You load it in Chrome, and when you load it in Chrome with your Disting NT connected via USB-C, you hold allow, and it goes, does a cool hacker thing. And now this Chrome web page made by expert sleepers is talking to my Disting NT. Now this is showing me the contents of the clock algorithm. And if we click up here to show routing, here we see a new way of seeing the inside of the Disting NT. And it's a truer way of looking at the way that the algorithms get routed. You can see a similar thing to the NT Helper, which, by the way, you can load at the same time. And then we can see a similar thing where we can see the blocks and we can move them up and down the stack. I won't do that now, but do you see how we see this wonderful kind of elevator lift thing? This is similar to elevator lift diagrams in skyscrapers. You know, this elevator goes from this floor to this floor, but not that one. There is a break here. This is actually a much, much nicer way of visualizing how auxes are routed in your patch. Hopefully keep you a little bit on the straight and narrow when you're doing really complicated patches like this one. And we can also, on any of these, click there, and now in a second it will update and it will show me the contents of that envelope, the various settings that I have. and I can put custom names for it, change the name of the preset, and do various other things. This seems like a really good solution to the complex process of visualizing how auxes are routed. This is much clearer to me. The truth looks more like this. But with that caveat aside, I really recommend NT Helper, and I also want to shout out the developer, Thor Inside, who helped me enormously troubleshooting the patching of my patch here. I also suggested things about the NT Helper after using it, and he implemented my suggestions the next day. This is in active development, and I'm sure will only get better. Massive shout out to him for being so incredibly helpful. Thank you. And I know that I've just made it sound like the Disting NT can be complicated and can tie you in knots. And that's because it can. It's a complicated system, as any deep thing is. And I want to state that there is help available, that there is a great community on Discord who are there to help you, other users who are experts in the Disting NT who'd be more than happy to help you problem solve. So you're not alone. To do what I have done here, master clock, a Turing machine, a quantizer, an envelope, a Turing machine, an octave shifter, a Plaits, a Turing machine, a quantizer, a Braids, an envelope, a VCA, another envelope, a sample playback unit with 8 channels, a stereo mixer with sends, a cloud just for reverb, and another envelope follower, as well as a control interface where I can present some of those controls to the panel. That's all contained within this module. And it's important to point out that this module is not maxed out in terms of its CPU. I'm at about 70% on one CPU and 53% on the other. I could do more. What I've done here in terms of how I've created this system is to sort of ape the kind of thing that I would do, you know, with my other live systems. I like having random voltage generators create the voltages, and that's one thing. But what I have to think about is that if I did this again, man, there's so many different ways that it could work. You could use this same interface to design just an infinite variety of different kinds of algorithmic sequences. You know, there is the scope to have grids in this because there are plugins that you can get for the Disting NT, including a full port of grids and so many other things. You know, I could have loopers built in so that my Plaits could have a looper part and I could grab loops and then, you know, I might just have one voice then and a looper and make it a kind of surgeon sort of Blawan style system. You know, the sky is the limit because there are so many different algorithms. And also, expert sleepers are very responsive. When I was working on this, I said to them, do you know what? It's a bit frustrating that the master clock doesn't have swing. Well, within 2 days, Oz added swing to this. So, you know, if you have suggestions, I think that they're quite interested to hear them and can potentially act on them for you. So this is actually quite a dumb and simple thing that I've built, even though it was a bit tricky for me to build it because I had to learn how to have concurrent voices that don't mess with each other. But it is totally doable. You just have to get into the kind of Disting headspace. And then once you've done the kind of obvious thing, then I think that the really interesting questions are, what are the very non-obvious things that I could do with, you know, only this, where only this, with its insane myriad of things that can work together in a variety of ways, can create. So I hope you got some value from seeing an application of the Disting NT. There are so many more algorithms like loopers and curbinators and all of these wild and wiggly wonderful things. And as you know, with the way that expert sleepers work is they just are continually putting more into this. So, you know, it will only do more, but with the grown-up caveat that it is deep and it will take you some time to get used to it. You've got to learn it like any sort of serious and deep thing. Thank you, expert sleepers, for having me do this. And thank you for watching.